The first time I noticed something strange, it was a Thursday night in late autumn. The air had a crisp chill, and I was settling into my usual routine in my cozy one-bedroom apartment. It wasn't much, but it was mine. After a long day at work, I like to curl up with a book or watch a crime documentary, the irony of which I'd later come to regret. That night, I decided on the latter. The glow of the TV lit up my small living room as I sat with a blanket wrapped around me, sipping tea. The streets outside were quiet, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. My building was old but well-maintained, with only a few other tenants. It was the kind of place where people kept to themselves, which was exactly why I had chosen it. As I watched the documentary, I felt a sudden prickling on the back of my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I paused the show, the apartment falling silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My curtains were drawn, and the only light came from the screen. Shaking it off, I resumed watching, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next morning, I woke up groggy and unsettled. I chalked it up to the eerie content I'd been watching before bed. But as I left for work, something caught my eye. A single footprint in the dew-covered grass outside my ground floor window. It wasn't large, but it was distinct. I brushed it off as a maintenance worker's or a stray passerby. After all, the building wasn't far from the main road. Work was uneventful, but when I returned home that evening, the unease crept back. My front door, which I always double-checked before leaving, felt different. The lock wasn't damaged, but it turned too easily, as though it hadn't been fully secured. I stepped inside cautiously, scanning the apartment. Everything was where I left it. My paranoia was getting the better of me. A week passed without incident, and I began to relax. But then came the note. It was a Friday evening, and I was rummaging through my mailbox when I found it. A small piece of paper, folded neatly, with my name written in shaky handwriting. My heart skipped a beat as I opened it. Inside, the words were scrawled in uneven, almost frantic letters. I see you. You shouldn't keep your curtains closed all the time. I froze. My hands trembled as I looked around. The hallway was empty, and the only sound was the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights above. I rushed back to my apartment, locking the door behind me and double-checking all the windows. My mind raced. Who could have left the note? How did they know my name? I considered calling the police, but hesitated. What would I tell them? That someone left me a creepy note? They'd probably dismiss it, and I didn't have any concrete evidence. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The following nights were restless. I kept my curtains tightly shut and double-checked all the locks before bed, but the sense of being observed grew stronger. Small things began to feel off. My kitchen chair was slightly out of place. A picture frame tilted ever so slightly. At first I told myself I was imagining things, but then I started hearing the faint creak of footsteps at odd hours, coming from the hallway outside my door. One night I decided to confront my fears. Armed with a kitchen knife, I waited by the peephole, watching for any sign of movement. Hours passed, and just as I was about to give up, I saw him. A shadow moved across the dimly lit hallway. My breath caught as I strained to see more. The figure stopped in front of my door. I could make out a man, tall with unkempt hair and a bulky jacket. He stood there motionless for what felt like an eternity before turning and disappearing down the hall. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to ask my neighbors if they'd noticed anything unusual. Most of them were either out or uninterested, brushing off my concerns with polite indifference. But when I reached the end of the hallway, I knocked on the door of apartment 4B. It was rented by a man named Peter. Quiet, reserved, and a bit odd. He rarely spoke to anyone, and I'd only seen him a handful of times. Peter opened the door a crack, his pale blue eyes peering out suspiciously. Yes? Hi, Peter, I said, forcing a smile. I was wondering if you've noticed anything strange around here lately. Any unusual visitors or noises at night? He stared at me for a moment before shaking his head. No, everything's fine, he said curtly, beginning to close the door. Wait, I said, stopping him. Have you Have you been in the hallway late at night? Peter's expression darkened. Why would I do that? He asked, his tone defensive. I mumbled an apology and retreated, feeling more unsettled than ever. Something about Peter's demeanor didn't sit right with me. That night I was determined to catch whoever was tormenting me. I set up my phone by the window, its camera aimed toward the hallway. If someone approached my door, I'd have proof. I sat in the darkness, waiting. Every creak and groan of the building setting my nerves on edge. Around 2 a.m., it happened. The faint sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. My phone's screen lit up as it began recording. Heart pounding, I peeked through the peephole. It was Peter. He stood there, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He was holding something. A small, folded piece of paper. I watched in horror as he slid it under my door and then walked away, his movements deliberate and unhurried. I waited until the hallway was silent before opening the door. The note was identical to the first one, but this time it read, "You can't ignore me forever." The next day, I called the police. They took my statement and promised to look into it, but without any real evidence of a crime, there wasn't much they could do. Frustrated, I decided to confront Peter myself. That evening, I knocked on his door. He answered, his expression unreadable. "Why are you doing this?" I demanded, holding up the notes. "What do you want from me?" Peter's eyes flicked to the notes and back to me. For a moment, he looked almost confused. Then he smiled, a cold, unsettling smile that sent a chill down my spine. You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice low and menacing. Before I could respond, he slammed the door in my face. That night, I couldn't stay in the apartment. I packed a bag and checked into a nearby motel. I felt safer there, but sleep still eluded me. The next morning, I returned to the building with the intention of moving out. Whatever this was, it wasn't worth staying. But when I arrived, something was off. The hallway outside my apartment was cordoned off with police tape. An officer stopped me as I approached. "Ma'am, you live here?" he asked. I nodded, my stomach sinking. "What happened?" "We got a call early this morning. A tenant reported a disturbance. When we arrived, we found..." He hesitated, glancing at his notes. "Peter from 4B. He's dead." My blood ran cold. "Dead? How?" The officer's expression darkened. "We're still investigating, but it looks like he took his own life, left a note saying something about voices, and them watching him." I felt a wave of nausea. Was Peter's torment connected to mine? Had he been the one watching me, or was he just another victim? I moved out that same week, leaving behind the apartment and its haunting memories. To this day, I still wonder what really happened in that building. Was Peter truly stalking me? Or was there something more sinister at play? Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel eyes on me, even in the safety of my new home.